Welcome to another episode from CRM Brew. Today we're going to do a deep dive into configuring the HTTP callout for Salesforce Flow. This beta feature debuts in the Spring 23 release, and it's a game changer for declarative platform app building. Some of the topics that we're going to cover today are creating and configuring an app with a third-party data provider. In this case, we're going to be using a service called Unsplash. This configuration is going to give us the API keys and URLs that are needed to configure the OAuth 2.0 authentication provider in Salesforce. From there, we're going to configure the external credential, the named credential, and from there, we're going to be able to build something really cool in Flow, starting with some HTTP callouts, which are these invocable actions that will return a list of topics, which I'll show you how to handle a collection from an external service. And then I'm going to get a random photo from Unsplash using the topic ID. We're also going to get a bonus, which is the choice lookup component, also in beta. That's ultimately going to show us those topics in a type ahead pick list. Throughout this entire episode, we're going to show you the gotchas and error messages that will pop up from time to time as you're using this beta software. And I'm going to give you all the resolutions that you need to work through them. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, it may be tempting to jump straight into Salesforce to configure the flow. However, because we're working with a third party to get their data, we actually need to do some stuff first to configure an app on their end so we can bring in that data into Salesforce. And I forgot to mention, Unsplash, if you've never heard of it before, is one of the internet's largest providers of freely usable photos. I think they have like 3 million photos through just a lot of different subjects and topics. It's a great resource if you need some photos for your websites. So back to our configuration here. I've logged in already using a developer account. Typically, when you're working with OAuth 2.0, you'll need to get a developer account with whatever service provider you're working with. And most developer accounts are free of charge. They'll let you set one up. They'll give you a set number of APIs that you can play with to build a solution for their platform. Since I've already created one, I'm going to create an app. When you go in and create an app, you just need to go through a couple of stages to get that set up. In this case, we'll call this one SF Demo 3. Give it a description, create application. Great. Now that we have that, there's also going to be some other pieces of information, such as the Authorize and token URLs. Those you'll typically find within the developer documentation for whichever site you're on. I was able to hunt this one down. This URL for the Authorize and this URL for the token, we're going to need these later on as we configure the authentication provider in Salesforce. And the last thing just to mention is you'll want to get familiar with the developer documentation with the various endpoints. So anytime you see something that looks like this, that's an endpoint where you can send in some parameters and then it's going to return back some data. We're going to do a deeper dive into all of this documentation a little later as we configure our invocable action, but just wanted to call that out as something that you'll want to spend some time researching in advance before you get into Salesforce to configure your flow. So let's go ahead and set up Salesforce. So the first step in setting up Salesforce is I recommend starting with creating a permission set. Now, it may seem like, hey, I'm an administrator, I don't need a permission set because, I have access to everything. When it comes to these external, or I should say, when it comes to the external providers, external credentials, there is a permission set that's required to be able to use that. And so when you create a permission set, you don't really need to configure anything here. There's nothing that needs to be set. You just simply go in there, assign yourself or whoever needs access to that external service, and you'll be good to go. I went ahead and configured this one already, so we'll just jump to the next step. Next, we have our authentication provider. Let's go ahead and go through the steps to create one. After clicking New, they're going to give us a list of provider types. The provider types are going to be really familiar looking services. A lot of big names out there that you can select. However, you'll notice that Unsplash is not listed anywhere in this list, which means we need to use the OpenID Connect, which gives us a blank slate to configure it from scratch. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll call this one Unsplash. For the URL suffix, we'll give it the same. Next, you'll see there's a consumer key and a consumer secret. This information we're going to get from our app that we just created over at Unsplash. There's also the Authorize endpoint, token endpoint. I just mentioned those earlier. You'll get that from the developer documentation. And you'll also notice that we have some checkboxes here. These checkboxes, depending on your service provider that you're connecting to, you'll need to find out which combination of checkboxes that need to be set to properly send those messages over for authentication. In my case, Unsplash is compatible with just unchecking all the boxes. Let's go ahead and jump back over to our app. We'll scroll down here. You'll notice that there is a keys section, an access key, and a secret key. Now you might have noticed that there's a different terminology that is between systems. That's pretty common. It's a little confusing, actually. I wish there was the same labels used between all the different service providers. But I think if you just look and see if it says the word secret, I mean, it's going to map to the consumer secret. And if it says something along the lines of key, it's most likely going to go into your consumer key. Next, let's go ahead and get our endpoints for Authorize and Token. We'll paste those in there. And the rest of these are optional. I don't believe they're necessary for our demo today, so we'll click Save. Now, one thing to note as we look at the configuration that was set up behind the scenes, there are some URLs that, one of which is incredibly important for communication, and that's the Callback URL. This is the other half of the handshake as Salesforce and Unsplash are talking with each other through the authentication process. We'll go ahead and copy this to our clipboard. We're going to go back to our demo, our app here. And you see this section here where it says redirect URI. This is where you need to put in the callback. So we'll go ahead, paste that in. All of these are fine as is. We'll click Save. Great. So basically what happens here is when the service is being used, it's going to do a call out to authorize, a call out to get a token that is going to be used for all future call outs. And after it gets that token, it sends a message back to Salesforce through this callback URL to let it know, here you go, here's all the data that you need. All right. Let's jump into the next step. That is the external credentials. So you'll find these external credentials under setup. If you type in named, you'll see named credentials, and tucked away in here are the external credentials. I know that seems a little confusing, but that's where it's located. We'll go ahead and click new, and then we'll type in unsplash external credentials. Then we'll look at our authentication, OAuth 2.0. We are doing a browser flow. JWT is something entirely different. It requires a certificate. That's a different way of authenticating into a system. We're doing something using an authentication provider, and you'll notice here that Unsplash is in the list. If you happen to come to this screen without first setting up an authentication provider, you're going to show up, or you're going to click on this and see nothing. And that's normal because there's no OAuth providers, custom OAuth providers that have been set up. If that happens, no problem. Just go back to the auth providers setup area, set up your authentication provider, come back here, and you'll be good to go. We'll click save. Next, we need to set up the permission set mappings. Using the permission set that we just created, we'll pick that from the list. And then for the identity type, we're going to choose named principal. Click save. And we have a permission set mapping. You'll notice here under authentication status, it says not configured. To configure this, you just simply need to go into here and say authenticate. And look at that, it sends us to unsplash OAuth authorize. That's the URL that we had just configured in our auth provider. And we'll go ahead and say, let's continue. It does its exchange of credentials between the systems. And if everything is successful, you'll see a message here that it was successfully authenticated and it's ready to be used. Now, one thing to note is if you don't go through the step of configuring this permission set or doing the authentication, you may see error messages when you try to use your Salesforce flow. Error messages such as we couldn't access the credentials or something along those lines, basically indicating there's an issue with the authentication. No problem, just come back here, get it authenticated, come back, and you're good to go. Oh, also, when you do this authenticate, you may see an error message that says the redirect URI included is not valid. What that means is there's something misconfigured on the app. That URI, that redirect URI, which points back to here, if something got forgotten or misconfigured in this part, you would see an error message as you begin to configure. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like so there's no surprises if it happens. To simulate that issue, we're going to go in and we're just going to remove this altogether. Click save. We're going to go back to Salesforce, and then we're going to say authenticate. Oh, the redirect URI included is not valid. So you may see that if you might have accidentally grabbed the wrong URL. It can be a little confusing at times as you get accustomed to these things. No problem. Just feed in a different URL, which is going to be the callback URL, and it'll work just fine. Let's go ahead and get this fixed. Click Save. Go back to here. Authenticate. And there you go. Now you'll notice that it didn't ask me to authorize. I think once you get the first one authorized, it must set up something behind the scenes that allows all future ones to not have to go through that explicit authorization. Okay, next step in all of this is to set up the name credential. We'll click New. Actually, I did that too quickly. You'll see a tab just to the left of external credentials called Name Credentials. And then when you click the New button, it'll take you here. Let's go ahead and type in unsplash named credential, unsplash named credential. Now this is where it's going to ask for the URL. This is the base URL where all of the API endpoints are located on your service provider. In our case, that base URL is this, and you'll find this in the developer documentation. So if you're not sure, just look through. You'll see some examples of callouts, and then you can discern what that base URL is. Sometimes that base URL might say v1 or v2 because API versions change from time to time. In this case, we don't need to specify anything else. This is good as is. As we move down here, we'll see the external credential. We'll choose that. This external credential has all of the authorization that was configured through our authentication provider. So these name credentials and external credentials work hand in hand to allow you to connect to these external systems. All of these callout options are good as is. In fact, I believe I heard that some of these are not yet supported in the beta version of the HTTP callout, so the defaults are just fine. Great. Now that we have our named credential, we're ready for the fun stuff. We're going to create our flow. So going over here, I went ahead and already opened up a flow. I want to show you what happens if you have a flow that's already open and you've already done all this configuration. What's going to happen is if you go in here to the HTTP callout under named credential, you'll see, well, in this case, bad example, I had gone in there and deleted everything. This is actually from cache. I had better do a refresh. Oops. Anyway, if you go in here for the very first time and then do all of this configuration and then try to set it up, you may not see what you just configured. In that case, save what you have, or if it's a brand new one, just hit refresh and you'll be able to see your named credential. So anyway, back to where we're at here. If you go to the plus sign, select action, create HTTP callout. we're going to go ahead and create an external service. This one we're going to call get topics. The name credential is the unsplash name credential. You'll see it brings in the base URL. Click next. And then we need to give the external service an action name. We'll go ahead and give it the same here, the method. If you've ever worked with endpoints before, and you may have noticed that things like post and put and delete, those are not yet listed here as methods. I won't get into what all those mean, but for now, the HTTP callout only supports get, but don't worry. I saw the roadmap, though the put, post, delete, those are coming. Next, we have our URL path. This builds upon the base URL. This is where we need to go back to our developer documentation and review what we need to put in here. In this case, since we're getting the topics, this is going to be our URL path. And as you can see, when you glue those two together, it creates a complete URL. This is where we can configure the query parameters. So going back over to our documentation, there's a list of parameters here. For our demo today, all of the defaults are just fine. The defaults are going to retrieve the first 10 topics from the list, and it'll just return back well, page 1 of 1. Next, we have to provide a sample response. What does that mean? So when we do these callouts to these endpoints, what's going to come back is something called JSON, J-S-O-N, JavaScript Object Notation. It's it may look kind of cryptic at first, but there's actually a bit of rhyme and reason to it. It represents the data in a really compact format. It's really, I mean, it's a really small payload of the type of bandwidth that it takes to transmit data over the internet. So if it looks a little confusing, no worries. It's just data, and we need to be able to provide a sample response so Salesforce can make sense of it. Let's go ahead and click New. And this is where we need to provide an example. This is where we need to go back to the documentation and pull in the sample response here. Now, just a forewarning, this can be one of the most challenging parts of getting your HTTP callout to work. I'm going to show you all the things that will pop up when you try to do this setup. So now that we've pasted in the sample response, we're going to click Review. First error message, and we're going to deal with a few. First error message is there's just something not right within the body. But the body in this case just means, in general, this entire thing, there's something in it that isn't quite right. I know that isn't incredibly helpful. It's a little generic. It doesn't specify specifically where. I'm going to show you a tool that's going to help you make sense of this. There's a website called JSON Lint. Lint is a developer term for combing through the syntax of JSON, and it's going to give you a bit more clarity into where the problems might lie. So you can paste that same response in here, click Validate JSON, and now it's actually giving us some line numbers that can help us pinpoint what's going on. First of which is there is an issue here with specifically this comma. This trailing comma, is a delimiter between topic 1, which is in the example here, and topic 2, which doesn't exist. And that is represented by this comment here, where there's going to be more topics. If we delete this out, click validate, oh, we got another issue here. And that issue is with the comment. Sometimes developers will throw in these little comments with like double forward slashes just to explain what's going on in the JSON. However, when it comes to validating it, the linter doesn't like it. Those all need to be removed. We'll click validate again. Oh boy, there's a bit more going on here. And I actually, before I started recording, I was doing tons of troubleshooting and discovered that the developer documentation actually just had an invalid example. It's just not going to be helpful. That might happen from time to time. Humans make mistakes. In those cases where if you're kind of wrestling with it and can't seem to figure out why it's not working, what I recommend is using a tool called Postman. Postman has got a web version. This is the downloadable version. Basically, it lets us do a direct call out using this tool. And I had to configure all the OAuth exactly like I did in Salesforce under the authorization tab. But basically, once you get all this configured and click send, it's going to give us an actual response back from the endpoint. So let's go ahead and use that instead. So, and actually in this case, it returned back 10 topics. We don't want to put in all 10. That's going to be a lot of troubleshooting for us. We're just going to pull in the very first one. So as I select that curly bracket and scroll down following that line, you'll see at this point right here represents the end of the first topic. And there's that little comma that we need to watch out for. So I'm going to go ahead, start with that curly bracket, go back up here and get this square bracket. This square bracket, if you're wondering, what the heck does that mean? That square bracket represents the beginning of a collection or a list of objects or a list of something in the system. We need to have that square bracket because we're returning back a list of topics. We need to make sure that's in the body of the JSON response so Salesforce knows that's working with a list. All right, back to Salesforce. Let me find my right tab here. Let me just close that out. All right, let's delete all this, paste. Next, we need to go back to our response here. We're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see that ending square bracket. That is the conclusion of the list. So we need to make sure that in Salesforce we put the square bracket there as well. All right, moment of truth. We're going to click review. Now we've got another error that we need to work through. Something's not right with the value specified for the field null. I have to say that threw me off a little bit because I was hoping it would give me a field name, but what it's saying is that there is a field in here with a value set to null, and we need to find that null and make it something that is something other than null. Why do we need to do that? Well, these null values are a little too nondescript for Salesforce to make sense of. So as Salesforce is going through and reading this JSON, it needs to know what kind of data it is. And if it's null, is it going to be an integer? Is it going to be a number with a decimal point? Is it going to be a string? All of those things need to be articulated in the sample that we provide. So this is where you may want to go back to the developer documentation, learn a bit about what type of data that field represents, and then go ahead and put in something that closely resembles it. In this case, this is a date time. This is also a date time. Here's another null. In this case, last name is a type of string. We're going to go ahead and put in an empty string. We don't necessarily need to type something in. A string is a string, so we'll just go ahead and set that. Go down here. Oh, we've got another null. It's an email. Email is a type of string, so we're just going to go in and put in an empty string. Next, sponsorship. For this, we'll make that a string. PayPal email, string. And there we go. All of our fields are set. One other thing I just want to note, you see here that this is a date time. In the beta version, anytime you have something that is represented as a string, and within that string is a date time, the data structure still will say string. It doesn't actually convert it into a Salesforce date time yet. I really hope that that is improved upon in the coming versions. For the purposes of sorting, it would be really nice to have something that we can do ascending, descending, because sorting on this may not necessarily result in the right sort order as a string. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and click review. We have another error message. Specify at least one variable or element for your list data type and try again. All right, what does that mean? The key word here is list. That is telling us that somewhere in here we have a collection that is empty, meaning Salesforce doesn't know how to create the data structure for something that's empty. It's kind of like saying it's null, but it's not technically null. It's just empty, undefined, or zero. Actually, it's probably more accurate to say there are 0 items in this list, or it's just undefined, which means we need to either define it or delete it. We'll go ahead and use our browser search. For this, we're going to do start square bracket, end square bracket, and lo and behold, it's going to show us all of the empty collections. You see this one right here. This one has a definition because, when the square bracket is started, there's stuff in here that describes what is in this list. Nothing between these square brackets. I don't know what is supposed to go here. And for demo purposes, it's okay if we just simply delete it. Go down here. We have another one. We'll delete it. And that's it. We have all of our data defined, or all of our sample data defined. We'll click review. Ooh, see this? This is what you want to see. This means Salesforce was able to make sense of this JSON, and now you can actually use this in your flow. Just as a little piece of advice, it's good to spot check this and make sure that everything looks the way it should. If anything looks a little bit off, like for example, if you were to look at this total photos and say, hey, this is not supposed to be an integer, this is supposed to be a number. This is where you can go in and Let me go ahead and show you here. You see where this says total photos integer. Since I changed this to something that has a decimal point, if I click review, you'll see how that is a number now, not an integer. Sometimes that'll happen in JSON responses. It may not provide the same level of decimal precision in the sample. No problem. You can just go in there, override it, do a review, and you're good to go. All right. I think that's all the things to look out for. Let's click done. Click done again. And here we go. We have our external service created. We have an invocable action that we can use. And now it's presenting us the modal dialog to actually use the action that's been created. We'll call this one get topics. Since we didn't create any parameters within our invocable action, there's nothing here to configure. We'll click done, and there it is. All right, action number 1 is down. Action number 2 is get random photo. Let's go ahead and go through that. Same steps as before. Call this one get random photo. Name credential, unsplash name credential. Click next. Label is get random photo. This is going to be a get. For the URL path, we'll go back to our developer documentation. We'll pull this, paste that in here. Here, we actually want to create a query parameter. So we're going to click on add key, go back here. And since we're going to be passing in a topic ID into this endpoint, we need to create a topic key. And this is going to be, in this case, it's going to be a string. Let's go ahead and provide our sample response. Going back over here, you'll notice that it actually provides 2 variations. When it's without the count parameter, right here, it returns back 1, and you'll see it starts with that curly bracket. If you're doing 2 or more, you'll see that it starts with the square bracket. That means it's returning a list, but we're just getting a single random photo, which means the count in this case is going to be the default of 1. So let's go ahead and select that sample. Spoiler alert, there's going to be more things to resolve here. So let's jump right in, paste in the results, click review. Something's not right with the body. Okay, let's go back to our linter and figure out what's going on. Paste, validate. First issue is we have a comment that needs to be removed. Let's do that. Validate. Oh, same issue as before. We have a comma there that needs to be removed. Validate again. Same issue as before. More collections. That comment needs to be removed. Validate. And oh, we have an issue here. You'll notice in this links how there's a few different links here, all delimited by a comma until you get to here and there's no comma. We need to put a comma in here. I kind of feel like the developers need to update their documentation because there are some syntax errors. That will happen from time to time, but let's go ahead and click validate. It's now valid JSON. That's a good sign. Let's go ahead and do a select all, copy, go back to our flow, select all, delete, paste, review. We've seen this one before. There's a null value in there. We'll do a quick search. Cover photo. We'll just make that an empty string. User, we'll make that an empty string. Oh, good, that's it. Review. Look at that. I always get excited when I see that data structure over here. Everything, I've already pre-checked all of this. This is good to go. We can click done, and here's our service. Let's go ahead and use our invocable action, get random photo. Let me go ahead and just add some spaces. You know what? We'll come back to here and pass in the topic once we get that screen set up to capture the topic ID. So let's click done. All right, things are looking good. We have both of our actions in place. That was the hard stuff. Everything else from here is easy. All right, next we're gonna go in. First, the topics that come back, they're not gonna be sorted properly. I'm gonna go ahead and do a collection sort. And we'll just say sort topics. This collection sort is such a cool thing. It was recently added. I don't remember which release, but it's makes life a lot simpler when trying to do little things like sorting. In this case, we're going to sort by title ascending. Everything else is fine. We'll click done. All right, next we're going to create our screen. In this one, we're going to say view photo as our screen name. For our screen component, this is where we're going to choose our choice lookup. Yep. We're going to call this topic. For our choice, you'll notice that there is no choice resource out there. We'd need to go through and create a collection choice set. This one we'll call topic collection choice set. And in the collection, we're going to say we're going to use the output from our get topics. I forgot to mention that anytime you see 2XX, that represents the HTTP status code. 200 is, or 201, there are a variety of HTTP status codes in the 200 range that are considered success responses. So if you see that 2XX, that's normal. It's just saying a successful response back from whatever external service you used. For the choice resource, we want to use our title as the label. That's going to be what gets displayed. And then behind the scenes, we want to use the ID for our actual value. That value is what's going to be fed into our other service. So we want to make sure that is set. All right. So now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and get our display text below. And here we're going to call this one photo. And then I'm going to type in the word description. We're going to do an insert resource. We're going to go to our outputs for get random photo, 2XX, and then pull in the description. So here we're going to show that. And next we're going to do an insert resource, but we need to create a new resource because if we want to display a photo using a URL, we're going to have to help out the display text component to craft the appropriate HTML to show that. So we'll click on New Resource, and we're going to choose Text Template, and we're going to call this one Photo Image, or I should say Photo URL. We need to switch this over to plain text because we're actually going to be typing in the HTML ourselves. That HTML is going to look like this: img src equals ending. Yep, there we go. And then we're going to insert. We're going to go to our random photo, 2xx. We're going to go here to links. And then we're going to choose, oops, hold on. I didn't mean to choose that one. Let's try that again. We're going to choose URLs. And the small version is going to be fine. So this is actually going to insert the URL of the photo, and we're going to wrap that URL in an image tag so it renders within our display component. We'll click Done. Photo URL is there. And that should be good. So in this screen, we were referencing stuff from the Get Random Photo, but you'll notice here that the Get Random Photo is after this screen, which means we need to do one little thing. We need to connect the element here back to the view photo. So to help you visualize what's going on, we're getting our list of topics, sorting them, displaying a list of topics here. You choose a list, choose an item from the list, click Finish, or I should say, in this case, it's gonna say Next. It's going to get the random photo and then send you back to the view photo screen to see it. I think there's one more configuration item that I had. It'll come to me later. We've done a lot of work here. We need to save. So let's go ahead and type in unsplash demo. The defaults there are going to be fine. All right. The moment of truth. Let's click debug and see if this actually works. Run. Okay. Let's click here. Look at that. We have topics. So this is a really cool component. As you can see, we can start typing in and it will just auto-complete. Let's start with nature. Click next. That's depressing. All right. I wouldn't call that nature, but let's try nature again. Okay. Very cool. Let's go to animals. That might be something fun there. Wait a second here. Hold on. You know what? I know exactly why this isn't working. I didn't actually go in here to set my topic yet. Here we go into this was the thing I thought. I was like, I know I'm forgetting something. All right, let's go ahead. We're going to pull in you see the choice lookup component, topic. We want the selected choice value. Click Done. All right, click Save. Click Debug. Click Run. Let's choose nature again. does that look like nature to you? Let me try that again. This, okay, B. Let me just double check here. Let's scroll down to topic, selected choice values. I mean, it is passing in something that looks very much like an ID. Let's try fashion and beauty. That one I feel like is going to be probably some kind of a person. Yeah, okay. So this is working. Some of these are a little obscure. Let's go to travel. Maybe there's something beautiful there. Okay, very cool. Anyway, you get the idea. We're getting a list of topics, feeding in the topic ID into the other action, which then gives us a URL to display on the screen. Great. So I just want to wrap up with some rundown of everything that we just went through. On the Salesforce side, we create a permission set, an authentication provider. We configured our third-party app to use the Callback URL provided by Salesforce. We created the external credential. We did the permission set mapping. We authenticated. We then created the name credential with that base URL. We then opened up our flow, went through the process of creating an invocable action with the endpoint parameters and that sample response. Hope you learned something new there. And lastly, we built something really cool. I mean, that's why we're doing this, is to use really cool tech to build really cool solutions. That's what gets me excited. Lastly, since we did something cool, celebrate. We did something fun, and we did something really devy without actually writing a single line of code. That's exciting. So I want to conclude with just a few tips. So before getting started with the HTTP callouts, get familiar with the third-party documentation of whatever system you're talking to. Figure out what steps you need to go through to create an app and generate the keys. Find that authorize and token endpoints to get your third-party service, and just get familiar with what sort of things can you do with that service, what parameters are optional, which ones are required, and make sure that JSON response is accurate. If you've never done this before, it may feel a little tough at first, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged with not just things that are unfamiliar, but things that are error messages. Integrations are tough for everyone. I've been doing this for 24 years, and I'm always learning something new. I'm solving problems day in and day out. Error messages are kind of my life. Don't get discouraged. Everybody goes through it. And also, just as a reminder, this is a beta feature, so there's going to be some rough edges, and those error messages are going to get refined. They're going to get easier to understand. And for the ones that we don't understand, just ask for help. The Salesforce ecosystem is incredible, and we're here to help. So the first place that you'll want to go to get that help is a new group called the HTTP Callout Beta group. It's on Trailhead, and this link I'll make available on my blog. And if you do ask for help within the community, it's great to provide screenshots and the steps to reproduce. Sometimes an error message alone may not be enough. Sometimes we need to know how you got there, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And when people jump in to help, such as the group manager like Kel, and she's absolutely amazing, say thank you. the community. I know when I jump in to help, I love hearing the word thank you. Kel does a great job at answering questions very quickly. So say thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for joining me. And let me know if you have any comments or questions. And lastly, happy trailblazing.